Good evening and welcome back to Alan Jackson Now. We're coming to you from just outside the city of Nashville. You have to go back to 1971 to find the beginning of the phrase, the war on drugs. That's when President Nixon decided that the spread of drugs through the freewheeling 60s had gone too far. Well, here we are 50 plus years later, and we're still at war. With us today is a former military intelligence officer and the White House drug czar advisor who's been fighting in the war on drugs for decades. Dr. Paul Chabot, welcome to our show.
Thanks, Pastor. Great to be with you and your audience.
Well, there are so many paths to discuss on this topic. It's really hard to know where to start. But let's begin where we're most aware of where the drugs are coming from these days through our open southern border. You know, the cartels have been funneling drugs across our border for decades, but now they're getting additional help, at least in some cases, competition, it seems like, from the thousands of Chinese migrants who've flooded into Mexico and this country. And now they're even producing their own drugs, fueled by fentanyl. How bad is it really? I'm not sure we trust the general media.
This is a crisis in our country. It's a crisis in every single family, in every single community, whether you're a red state or a blue state. Affluent, rich, poor, in between. It impacts every single household. 1 out of 5 kids right now in our public schools are using an illicit drug. Drug usage is at an all-time high in this country. We are literally failing. And if you look at the Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C., 58,000 plus Americans killed during a war. We lose double that every single year in our country. And yet I think we've become numb to this. Pastor, you talked about the border. My dissertation was on drug cartels. I wrote a book about it. Embedded myself in understanding the evil along our southern border. And that's what we are up against. That evil, which Ronald Reagan fought and shut down the border when DEA agent Kiki Camarena was tortured and killed in the 80s, is wide open today. And drug cartels know this. And quite honestly, they're not only flooding across our border, they are now living in our communities. You mentioned the Chinese nationals and others buying American property, buying farmland. They have infiltrated the entire state just north of me. If you look at Oklahoma and other states where they have sort of moved into this medical marijuana business, the cartels and organized crime have flooded in there and taken over their communities. There is a crisis, and we have a failure in leadership right now in D.C. This problem can be addressed, but it's not being addressed in the right measure.
Yeah, I think your characterization of evil is appropriate. This is not a political struggle. This is a battle between good and evil, and we have to think of it in those kind of stark terms. I know you've had some success in combating the cartels, but it seems to me, at least from a layman's perspective, that they're stronger than ever with more money involved. Is it even reasonable to think we can defeat the cartels?
I'm going to be a little defeatist on this for a minute. And my position has evolved because I've been embedded in this for so long. I'm now 50 years old. When I was 12 years old, I went through drug rehab. I now have 38 years sobriety. I've been working on this, since my teenage years and have watched this happen. When I went to Iraq in 2008, I had a chance to work with our Joint Special Operation Forces, devise a strategy to help combat the implications of terror. And what I realized then, and based on my dissertation work on cartels, is that whether we are talking about terror networks, drug cartels, organized crime, they all share the same characteristics. And it's fascinating, but it's complicated. And to boil this down to 10 seconds. These organizations, absolutely sinister and evil, they operate like Fortune 500 companies, compartmentalized, and they are absolutely ahead of the game in almost every single thing that we throw at them. And so, Pastor, I describe it this way. If you watch a horror movie and at the end of the movie, the good person or the good girl has, cut down that monster and the monster's on the ground. But the problem is once you turn your back on that monster, it regenerates and it grows again and it attacks again. And that's what we're seeing. And so my dissertation, my book work was on resiliency, and that we have to understand that, quite honestly, we're never going to win a war. We're never going to win a war on homelessness. We're always going to have that problem, or poverty, or drugs. But what we've got to do a better job of is shrinking the problem every single year to have measurable successes. And we are not doing that today. And there are ways that we can do that, because in this country, we've done it before.
Yeah, I think you're hinting at something that I want to push a little further into. It's this notion of surrendering the drug war. Dr. Chabot, it seems like to me almost every other month there's a new state that, if they don't legalize marijuana, they certainly broaden the ramp into participating with that.
Yeah.
You mentioned the cartels getting involved in the middle of America with the marijuana
Absolutely.
trade. Have we just abandoned the war on pot and conceded the field?
Unfortunately, we have, and it's from a political perspective. And I'll trace this back to George Soros and his funding over 30 years ago into California's, I think it was called I forget the proposition, but California was the first state really to move forward with what was called medical marijuana. Well, there was nothing medical about this. This was a Trojan horse, not just for marijuana legalization, which we see today, but outright legalization of all drugs. And so when we talk about the evilness, we know that every drug addict that is out there was born innocent. They didn't wake up one day and say, hey, Pastor, I want to be a heroin addict tomorrow. They all started off somewhere. And we know the intoxicants that are very prevalent in this community, most of it begins with marijuana. And the problem is, and I'll just be very direct, I do not understand the Democrat Party in this context. They fight so hard against tobacco, and I'm with them. You know, I used to smoke, I get it. But why is it that they then look the other way and take money from political action committees up and down the halls of Congress that promote marijuana legalization? If you look at this from that context, the money behind drug legalization, marijuana legalization, I cannot wrap my arms around the fact that one party is against tobacco, raising taxes. You can't smoke on California beaches, but yet they'll take money and push legalization across our communities. And the bottom line is, we know the harm that it does to kids, families, and our community, including rise of crime and poverty. And addiction rates are out of control.
Yeah, you mentioned political leaders that take down barriers to behaviors that we know scientifically are destructive. It reminds me when I was in school, whether it was high school or even later, there was always that professor or some organization that would invite the kids in, and then they would kind of deconstruct barriers that their parents wanted. It was a way of winning favor and getting participation. I think that's what the politicians are doing to us as a culture, and it's wicked. It's got to stop. Most of us, at least people my age, marijuana's been around since we were kids. It's been a part of the culture. But everything I read says the marijuana today is not like what there was in the street 30 or 40 years ago. It's far more potent, far more dangerous. Is that accurate, or is that just hype?
Now, this is probably one of the biggest points, and it's where your generation, the older generation that looked at sort of the 1960s and 70s, back then, the marijuana I was smoking in the 80s, before I went to rehab, was about 1 to 3% THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. It's up to 400%. It is a completely different drug today. And it's not just smoking it, it's in edibles, high edibles, CBDs or gummies, which are prevalent even here in the state of Texas, which does not legalize marijuana, but the back door to this is CBD and Delta 8. Look, and I know we're throwing a lot of terms out there for your audience, like what is Delta 8 and gummies? God bless you all because you live in an innocent community, but this problem is coming to you. If you look at Oklahoma, I give that as an example. I drove my kids through there to a YMCA camp from Texas through Oklahoma. And every single billboard that my kids saw was about marijuana, pro marijuana, buying marijuana. We stopped to get gas. I could not keep my kids away from it. And so if it can happen in the Bible Belt, the great state of Oklahoma, it can happen anywhere. And how it happens, Pastor, it's about money, big money, lobbyists. They come in and they trick the voters. They say, look, if you want to do away with organized crime, you got to legalize it so we can regulate it. You can't do this. It's a failed experiment in California. When they legalized it, drug use went way up. Cartels moved not just from Mexico, but they moved into California. They control these operations. And so now what we see is a Pandora's box. A genie's been out of the bottle. How do you put it back in? Pastor, I don't have the answer to that. What I do have is a warning to every state that is left standing that has not followed that destructive path. And that is, don't take the money. It's evil, it's dirty, it's going to destroy your community, and stand up and speak to the issues about kids in your community.
Marijuana is a gateway drug. It leads to further addiction. I know there's voices that say it's not, but I've lived long enough and I have enough experience with people that struggle with addictions. Does your experience find that to be true?
It's huge. And more people are entering rehabilitation today for marijuana than for every other single drug combined. We look at the psychosis that's cancer associated with schizophrenia. The mind of a person, a child, continues to develop up through their mid-20s. We talk about the complications today. We might talk about social media, computers, and we talk about that. But there is a gap of us talking about substance abuse. even in Texas here, and I will go back to Texas a few times, most of our schools in Texas do not participate in what is called the Texas School Survey. It's a free survey where they can gauge the kids in a confidential effort to gauge what is the prevalence of drugs in our communities. Pastor, the problem we're finding is that even in communities that are bedroom communities, they are afraid to acknowledge this problem. And no matter where you are across America, when I speak to audiences and I ask them this simple question, Pastor, how many of you know somebody that's died due to a substance abuse related incident? And almost all the hands go up in that audience. And I tell them, keep your hands up and look around this room. Why is it that we are making other things such a priority and ignoring the things that are literally destroying the fabric of our families? To me, it is evil. It is destruction. And we need the churches to get front line and center and speak about this, not just Sundays, but every single day, because it does impact all of us.
I could not agree with you more. I've done the last funeral I ever want to do for some young person who lost their life because they miscalculated some drug they bought on the street. It's horrific. We'll be right back with more from Dr. Paul Chabot.
To Babylon! Can you tell me what I saw and what it means?
Take me to the king.
Here is the prisoner, Daniel the Hebrew, an enemy of the king.
God, do you see? Do you hear? We need you now.
We're back now with Dr. Paul Chabot. He's had a lot of high-level jobs, and one of them was as a 3-time presidential advisor to the White House Office of Drug Control. Paul, you've written about how the drug epidemic affects not just the users, but also judges, leaders in high office, the military, even the police. Can you explain that idea to our listeners?
Yeah, certainly we are at a crossroads today where 30 years ago, most people knew of marijuana or they heard of cocaine. But most people today have not heard of GHB, ketamine, Rohypnol. They've heard about the synthetics, the one pill can kill, which the DEA has done a very good job with fentanyl, at least trying to get kids to understand that even experimenting one time, you can lose your life. I think the challenge that we have today is that a lot of our senior folks in advisory positions do not understand the totality of the problems that we are facing. Look, when you look at the problem, Pastor, like I said in your earlier segment, we're never going to eliminate this. We're never going to win this war. In fact, I think we should change the trajectory on this conversation that it's not a war. We got to look at this as a cancer, something we can treat. We got to make this problem smaller and smaller every single year. The problem is our government, we're not measuring for effectiveness every single year to tell the public whether or not we're doing a good job. And right now we are doing a horrible job in this country. But there is a proven method. We've done this before in this country. We were able to drop drug use down from, a huge rate down to a very small percentage, but now we've reversed it. And if you can imagine a balloon, this balloon is the problem, this drug problem of what we have today. We can't just arrest our way out of it. It's about applying pressure at all corners, education, prevention, treatment, enforcement, and addressing the recovery aspect of this with people that go through recovery. I'm in recovery. Some of the most genuine people that I've ever met, Pastor, are those that have been through any type of a challenging circumstance, recovery, whether it's sex addiction, drug addiction, whatever it is, alcohol addiction, and you come through that. We need to recruit those people that have been in the battles, that have been in the throes of this evil, to come out and discuss this from their personal experiences, because they have absolute credibility because they've been on both sides.
Yeah, I think your suggestion that we reframe this discussion is really important. A war, we expect to have a victory point and a termination point, and then we just celebrate the victory. But what you're really describing is the health of our nation, and particularly the health of our young people. And if we unleash this torrent of drugs upon them, we're destroying their health emotionally, physically, spiritually. I mean, it really is, the reshaping of that makes a big difference. Thank you for that adjustment.
No, my pleasure. And let's talk about our country. We obviously love this place. We're here. We want to see it, survive. But look, we are still one of the youngest republics on this planet. And when you look at our adversaries across this world that look at the United States and want to overcome us, we have a population that is getting more and more dependent on illicit drugs. We have a problem recruiting men and women to serve not only in law enforcement, but in our military. And how about our adversaries? How do they look at this as our country? If we have such high addiction rates of what we know, and I said earlier, 1 out of 5 on average using an illicit drug amongst every 5 kids, and you multiply that throughout our society, where are we going to be, and how can America stay the strongest, freest nation on this planet when we have such a drug epidemic amongst our youth that then rise up and take over for our generation? We've got to look at this as a long-term problem with solutions that we can put in place. We can look back historically. Ronald Reagan, I'll tell you, Nancy Reagan started Red Ribbon Week. Red Ribbon Week, by the way, was honored for Kiki Camarena, who I mentioned earlier. He was a DEA agent assigned in Mexico to work against the cartels. He was tortured, he was killed, and Ronald Reagan shut down that Mexico border in the 1980s until we got our killers back. Here's what I don't understand, is we are losing lives in this country every single day, every single minute, every single second because of drugs that are coming across this border. Why is it we can't have the same rule of law with Mexico right now, saying we're going to address this drug problem, we're going to stop giving you foreign aid until you address the cartel issue. We're going to shut down this border like Reagan did. We're going to make this a serious issue because it is about the health and safety of our country.
Well, you have the experience with this from the highest levels of the government. Do our police and military even have the tools they need to combat these cartels?
No, and God bless our men and women, but remember, we follow the law. And the reason evil is able to have these victories is because they don't. They don't play by the same rules. There is no red tape. There is no bureaucracy. There is no wiretap warrants. They exist in third world countries where there is lack of societal rule of law and corruption, which is what my research has shown over and over and over again, which is why, although we are strong here in this country, we have not always been strong. If you think about corruption and the mob in Chicago in the 1930s, 40s, corruption was rampant. Judges, cops were on the take. We rooted that out. We need more Elliot Nesses to take on this organized crime mentality, but we also need the courage to be able to stand up to it. And this courage is in the halls of Congress because they're taking money from Marijuana Policy Project and all these other organizations that literally are all about open society, which is anything goes. And this anything goes is what is destroying the fabric. So certainly our men and women on the front lines need the tools and resources, but they're hampered by the political leaders, which are taking money from the hands of evil and really desecrating the effort of what we could be doing much better.
Amen. Well, thank you, Dr. Chabot. Keep fighting the good fight and come back when you see some more progress out there. We would love to hear the good news. I'll be back with some final thoughts in just a moment. You know, we recently celebrated the anniversary of D-Day. We remember those great sacrifices that the generation made when they landed on the beaches of Normandy and faced such great challenges. We celebrated Memorial Day not long ago, remembering those who gave their lives so that you and I could know liberty and freedom. Well, I've come to understand that before you can engage in conflicts of that nature, the people that are doing the fighting have to understand what they're fighting for. They have to believe in good and evil. That's not a fashionable discussion any longer. We've been told that all truth is subjective, that you have truth and I have truth and everybody has truth. Well, there is such a thing as an objective truth. There is right and wrong, good and evil. And we've reached a place in our journey as a nation where we're going to have the courage to reassert that idea. When we talk about the health of our nation, the war on drugs, the pharmaceuticals that are being unleashed on the younger generation, it's evil. There are people who are intentionally sexualizing our young children at an early age, and they would like to do it without their parents' awareness. They're mutilating our adolescents. They would like to do that without parental approval. And they also want to unleash illicit drugs in their lives, introduce them, make them legal, more accessible. Folks, those behaviors are evil. It's not about opinion. They will diminish the younger generation, rob them of their future, and you and I cannot afford to be distracted and look away. I understand if you take that stand with your family or in your peer group that some people are going to attach a label to you. They'll say you're angry, you're filled with something. But the reality is you're filled with the truth. I believe there's a God in heaven. I believe good and evil do exist. And I believe if you and I would take the assignment of simply doing what pleases God, we don't have to be angry or belligerent and certainly not violent. Let's decide to please God. Then I believe He'll intervene to protect our children and young people. That's a better path to the future. There are more reasons for hope than reasons for despair. Well, that's our report for now. We hope you better understand what the authorities are up against. I'm Alan Jackson. Good night from Nashville.